The streets of London buzzed with energy as Marcus stepped out of the taxi, his eyes wide with excitement. The city was everything he had imagined, bustling, historic, and alive with stories waiting to be discovered. He had traveled all the way from Australia, leaving behind his quiet suburban life, to experience the grandeur of one of the world's most iconic cities. Today, his destination was Buckingham Palace, the heart of British tradition and royalty. As he approached the palace gates, Marcus felt a thrill run through him. Hundreds of tourists milled about, snapping photos and marveling at the towering structure. Some were dressed in their finest clothes, while others carried maps and guidebooks, trying to soak in every detail. But what caught Marcus's attention the most were the royal guards standing tall and silent near the entrance. Their red uniforms and towering bearskin hats made them look almost otherworldly, like statues come to life. Marcus couldn't help but grin as he watched people try to get a reaction from the guards. Tourists waved their hands in front of their faces, made silly faces, or even pretended to punch them lightly. From a safe distance, of course. But no matter what they did, the guards didn't flinch. They stood perfectly still, their expressions blank, as if nothing could shake their focus. It was both impressive and amusing to watch. But Marcus wasn't just any tourist. He had always been the kind of person who liked to stand out in a crowd. Back home, he was known for pulling harmless pranks or coming up with quirky ideas to make ordinary moments unforgettable. Whether it was organizing flash mobs at family gatherings or wearing outrageous costumes to parties, Marcus thrived on being the center of attention. And now, surrounded by hundreds of strangers, he felt an itch to do something that would make this trip truly special. He wandered closer to the guards, observing them closely. One guard in particular caught his eye, a tall, broad-shouldered man whose hat seemed impossibly large. Marcus tilted his head, studying the intricate details of the fur. Something mischievous sparked in his mind. What if he could find a way to break the guard's stoic demeanor? Surely, there had to be something that could make these legendary figures crack. At first, the idea was vague. Maybe throw a small object near them or shout something unexpected. But as Marcus dug into his backpack for his camera, his fingers brushed against something else, a small lighter he had brought along for late-night cigarettes. An audacious thought crossed his mind. What if he could create a moment so bold, so shocking, that it would leave everyone talking? The more he thought about it, the more the idea took hold. With a smirk, Marcus glanced around. The crowd was distracted, cameras clicking and chatter filling the air. No one was paying attention to him. His heart raced with a mix of nerves and excitement. Could he really pull this off? Would anyone stop him? The guard stood motionless, unaware of the chaos about to unfold. Marcus took a deep breath, gripped the lighter tightly in his hand, and stepped closer, his mind made up. Little did he know, this decision would change everything, for better or worse. Marcus's heart pounded as he moved closer to the guard, his fingers tightly clutching the small lighter in his pocket. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but instead of doubt, it fueled his determination. This was his chance to do something unforgettable, something that would make people remember him long after he left London. With a deep breath, he pulled the lighter from his pocket and flicked it open, the tiny flames springing to life. The crowd around him was oblivious, their attention focused on snapping photos or trying to get a reaction from the guards. Marcus took another step forward, positioning himself just behind the tall guard with the towering bearskin hat. His mind raced with thoughts. Was this too bold? Would anyone notice? But before he could second-guess himself, he stretched his arm upward, bringing the flame dangerously close to the edge of the hat. The fur was thick and dense, but within seconds, a small wisp of smoke began to rise. At first, no one seemed to notice. Tourists continued chatting and posing for pictures, unaware of the chaos about to unfold. But then, someone screamed, "What's happening?" A woman shouted, pointing at the guard. Heads turned, and gasps rippled through the crowd as they saw the faint flicker of flames licking the edge of the iconic hat. The once stoic guard, trained to remain motionless under any circumstance, finally broke protocol. His gloved hand shot up, swatting at the fire in a desperate attempt to extinguish it. Marcus froze, his grin faltering as the reality of what he'd done hit him. The crowd erupted into chaos. Some people backed away in fear, while others rushed forward, shouting for help. Parents shielded their children, and tourists scrambled to capture the scene on their phones. The air was filled with a mix of panic and disbelief. A few brave souls tried to assist the guard, offering water bottles or jackets to smother the flames, but security officers were already sprinting toward the scene. As the commotion grew louder, Marcus realized he was standing right in the middle of it all. His face flushed red as eyes turned to him, some accusing, others shocked. "Did you do that?" a man nearby demanded, pointing a finger at Marcus. Before he could respond, a security officer grabbed him by the arm, pulling him back from the guard. "What were you thinking?" The officer barked, his voice cutting through the noise. Marcus stammered, trying to explain himself. "It was just a joke," he said, forcing a nervous laugh. But his words fell flat. No one was laughing. The guard, now free of the flames, stood stiffly, his hat slightly charred but still intact. His expression remained unreadable, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of anger. Around him, the crowd buzzed with outrage. "How could someone do that?" One woman muttered. "This is disgusting," another added, shaking her head. Security officers surrounded Marcus, their voices sharp and demanding. They asked for his identification and began questioning him about his intentions. Cameras flashed wildly as news of the incident spread like wildfire. Videos of the flaming hat were already being uploaded to social media, accompanied by captions calling Marcus reckless and disrespectful. Tourists who had been enjoying a peaceful day at Buckingham Palace now found themselves witnesses to an act that seemed almost unbelievable. As Marcus stood there, flanked by officers and stared at by hundreds of strangers, he felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. What had started as his silly idea to stand out in a crowd had spiraled into something far more serious. The laughter he had hoped to elicit was nowhere to be found. Instead, he was met with anger, confusion, and disappointment. For the first time, Marcus began to wonder if his desire to make a memory had gone too far. The moment the flames touched the guard's bearskin hat, chaos erupted like a storm breaking over calm waters. The crowd, which had been buzzing with excitement just moments earlier, now surged with panic and disbelief. People who had been casually snapping photos or chatting with friends suddenly found themselves caught in a whirlwind of confusion. Some screamed, their voices sharp and piercing, while others froze in place, their eyes wide with shock as they stared at the unthinkable scene unfolding before them. The guard, whose stoic demeanor had been unshakable until now, finally moved. His gloved hand shot up to swat at the flames, his movements quick but controlled. The once pristine hat, a symbol of tradition and discipline, was now marred by smoke and scorch marks. Tourists nearby sprang into action, grabbing water bottles from their bags or offering jackets to help smother the fire. A man shouted, "Put it out. Hurry," as he rushed forward, only to be stopped by security officers who were already converging on the scene. Amid the commotion, Marcus stood frozen, his lighter still clutched in his hand. The reality of what he'd done crashed over him like a wave. The laughter he had imagined never came. Instead, he was met with horrified stares and angry murmurs. Parents pulled their children closer, shielding them from the scene, while others pointed fingers at him, their expressions a mix of disgust and disbelief. "Who does something like that?" One woman muttered under her breath, shaking her head. Her words carried weight, echoing the thoughts of everyone around her. Security officers wasted no time. Within seconds, two of them had grabbed Marcus by the arms, pulling him away from the guard and the growing crowd. Their grips were firm, leaving no room for escape. "What were you thinking?" one officer demanded, his voice cutting through the noise like a knife. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His mind raced, searching for an explanation that could make sense of his actions, but all he could manage was a weak, "I didn't mean for this to happen." The crowd continued to swell as more people gathered, drawn by the commotion. Phones were held high, capturing every detail of the incident. Videos of the flaming hat and Marcus being detained spread like wildfire across social media platforms. Hashtags like hashtag Buckingham Palace Incident and hashtag Royal Guard Attack began trending within minutes, sparking heated debates online. Some called Marcus reckless, while others labeled him disrespectful, questioning how anyone could treat such a historic symbol with such disregard. As Marcus was led away, his face flushed with embarrassment. He couldn't help but notice the guard. Despite everything, the man remained composed, standing tall even as his hat bore the scars of the incident. His expression was unreadable, but there was a quiet dignity in the way he held himself, a stark contrast to the chaos surrounding him. Marcus felt a pang of guilt, though it was quickly overshadowed by fear. For the first time, he realized the gravity of his actions, not just the immediate consequences, but the ripple effect they would have on so many people. The officers escorted Marcus toward a nearby security booth, their pace brisk and purposeful. Behind them, the crowd continued to murmur and shout, their voices blending into a cacophony of outrage. Tourists who had come to admire the grandeur of Buckingham Palace were now witnesses to an act that seemed almost surreal. As Marcus glanced back at the scene, he saw cameras flashing and phones recording, capturing his face in ways he had never intended. What had started as a misguided attempt to stand out had spiraled into something far beyond his control, leaving him trapped in a nightmare of his own making. Inside the security booth, Marcus sat slumped in a chair, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to process what had just happened. The room was small and sterile, with pale walls and a single flickering fluorescent light overhead that cast harsh shadows across the space. Two officers stood in front of him, their expressions stern and unyielding. One held a notepad, jotting down notes as they fired questions at him, while the other kept a watchful eye on his every move. "What were you thinking?" The first officer asked again, his voice sharp and impatient. "Do you have any idea how serious this is?" Marcus swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to explain himself, to make them understand that it wasn't supposed to turn out like this, that it had all started as a silly prank gone wrong. But the words felt hollow even in his own mind. How could he justify setting fire to a royal guard's hat in front of hundreds of people? Instead, he stammered, I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. It was just a joke." The second officer snorted, shaking his head in disbelief. "A joke? You think endangering someone's life is funny? That hat is part of our national heritage. Do you even realize what you've done?" Marcus flinched at the accusation, guilt washing over him like a cold wave. He glanced down at his hands, avoiding their piercing gazes. For the first time, he began to see the enormity of his actions, not just the immediate chaos but the deeper implications. The royal guards weren't just symbols. They represented centuries of tradition, discipline, and respect, and he had treated them like props in some twisted game. Outside, the crowd hadn't dispersed. Through the thin walls of the security booth, Marcus could hear muffled voices, angry shouts, concerned murmurs, and the occasional wail of a child frightened by the commotion. He pictured the scene unfolding beyond the door, tourists snapping photos, reporters arriving to document the incident, and the guard standing quietly amidst it all, his dignity intact despite the damage done to his uniform. The image filled Marcus with shame. "Do you know what kind of trouble you're in?" The first officer continued, leaning forward slightly. His tone was less aggressive now, but no less serious. "This isn't just about property damage or public disorder. This is about respect for our culture, our history, and the people who protect it." Marcus nodded slowly, unable to meet the officer's eyes. He knew they were right. Back home, he'd always been the fun-loving guy, the one who made people laugh and turned ordinary moments into memories. But here, In this unfamiliar place, his antics had crossed a line he hadn't fully understood until now. What had seemed like harmless mischief back in Australia felt reckless and disrespectful in the context of London's rich traditions. As the interrogation dragged on, Marcus found himself replaying the events in his mind. He remembered the way the crowd had reacted, the screams, the gasps, the angry stares, and cringed at the thought of being caught on camera. By now, videos of the incident were probably circulating online, spreading far beyond the confines of Buckingham Palace. People around the world would be watching, judging, and condemning him for his actions. The weight of that realization settled heavily on his shoulders. Finally, after what felt like hours, the officers stepped back, exchanging a glance before turning their attention back to Marcus. "You'll be held accountable for this," one of them said firmly. "We're going to need your full cooperation moving forward." Marcus nodded again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I understand." For the first time since arriving in London, Marcus felt truly alone. The excitement of his trip had been replaced by regret, fear, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility for the mess he created. As the officers led him out of the security booth and toward a waiting police car, he couldn't help but wonder if there was any way to undo what he'd done, or if this moment would define him forever. By the time Marcus was taken to the police station, news of his reckless act had already exploded across social media and international headlines. Videos of the flaming hat and his sheepish expression as he was detained were everywhere, accompanied by captions that ranged from outrage to disbelief. "Tourist burns Royal Guard's hat in shocking stunt," one headline read, while another declared, "Disrespectful prankster sparks outrage at Buckingham Palace." The incident wasn't just a local story, it had become a global talking point. Back home in Australia, Marcus's family woke up to a barrage of notifications. Friends and acquaintances began calling, asking if the man in the viral videos was really him. His parents sat in stunned silence as they watched clips of their son being led away by officers, his face pale and his shoulders slumped. They had always known Marcus to be adventurous and fun-loving, but this was something else entirely, something they struggled to comprehend. How could he do something so thoughtless? His mother whispered, tears streaming down her face. Meanwhile, Buckingham Palace released an official statement condemning the act. "The Royal Guards are symbols of our nation's history and values." The statement read, "This deliberate act of disrespect not only endangers individuals but also tarnishes the dignity of the institution they represent. We trust that appropriate measures will be taken to address this unacceptable behavior." The words carried weight, resonating with people around the world who viewed the monarchy as a cherished part of British culture. Public reaction was swift and polarized. Social media platforms lit up with debates about accountability, cultural sensitivity, and the line between humor and harm. Some users defended Marcus, arguing that his actions, while misguided, didn't warrant such severe backlash. "He's just a tourist who made a dumb mistake," one comment read. "Let's not ruin his life over a prank." Others, however, were far less forgiving. "This isn't a joke, it's vandalism and disrespect." Another user wrote, "There should be consequences for behaving like this in someone else's country." As the days passed, Marcus remained in custody, awaiting formal charges. He spent hours sitting alone in his cell, replaying the events in his mind. Each time he thought about the guard's calm demeanor amidst the chaos, he felt a fresh wave of guilt. What had started as a desire to stand out had spiraled into something far more destructive. He realized now that his actions weren't just about him. They had affected countless others, from the guard whose composure he had disrupted to the tourists whose experience had been ruined. When Marcus finally appeared in court, reporters packed the room, eager to document every detail of the proceedings. The judge listened intently as prosecutors outlined the case against him, citing charges of criminal damage, public disorder, and endangerment. Marcus's lawyer argued that his client had acted impulsively without malice, emphasizing his lack of prior offenses and expressing remorse on his behalf. Still, The gravity of the situation was undeniable. In addition to legal penalties, Marcus faced mounting pressure from the court of public opinion. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs that read "Respect our guards" and "Tourists must behave." Some shouted angrily, demanding justice, while others simply stared silently, their disapproval evident in their expressions. Inside, Marcus sat quietly, his head bowed as he absorbed the full weight of the backlash. Despite the overwhelming criticism, there were moments of reflection. A few journalists highlighted the broader issue of cultural insensitivity among travelers, using Marcus's story as a cautionary tale. One article posed the question, how can we encourage responsible tourism without vilifying those who make mistakes? It sparked thoughtful discussions about the importance of understanding and respecting local customs when visiting foreign countries. For Marcus, the fallout was both humbling and sobering. As he left the courthouse that day, flanked by security to shield him from the crowd, he knew his life would never be the same. The incident had stripped away his carefree attitude, forcing him to confront the consequences of his actions. But deep down, he also felt a flicker of resolve, a determination to learn from his mistakes and find a way to make amends. Little did he know, this moment would mark the beginning of a long journey toward redemption. The cold, gray walls of the holding cell offered little comfort as Marcus sat on the edge of a stiff metal bench, his elbows resting on his knees. The room was eerily quiet except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights above and the occasional distant echo of footsteps in the hallway. For the first time in his life, Marcus had nothing to distract him. No phone, no friends, no jokes to lighten the mood. All he had were his thoughts, and they were relentless. As the hours stretched into days, Marcus replayed the incident over and over in his mind. He saw the guard's calm face, the flicker of flames catching the edge of the bearskin hat, the crowd's horrified reactions. Each memory felt like a punch to the gut, leaving him more ashamed than before. What had seemed like a harmless prank at the moment now loomed as a reckless act that disrespected not just one person, but an entire institution steeped in history and tradition. For the first time, Marcus began to understand the weight of what he'd done. The royal guards weren't just figures in uniforms. They represented centuries of discipline, honor, and sacrifice. They stood unwaveringly through rain, heat, and even provocation, embodying the values of their country. And Marcus had treated them like props in his selfish quest for attention. The realization hit him hard, making it difficult to sleep or eat. Every time a guard walked past his cell, he couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt, wondering if they knew who he was. One evening, after another long day of questioning and processing paperwork, Marcus picked up a pen and a piece of paper provided by the officers. At first, he didn't know what to write, but the words eventually came pouring out. "Dear sir," he began, addressing the guard whose hat he had damaged. "I want to start by saying how deeply sorry I am for my actions. What I did was thoughtless, disrespectful, and completely unacceptable. I never intended to harm you or ruin your duty, but I understand now that my behavior was wrong." He went on to explain his intentions, or lack thereof, admitting that he had been seeking attention without considering the consequences. "I'd spent a lot of time thinking about what happened," he wrote, "and I realize now that I acted selfishly. You were doing your job with dignity and respect, and I failed to show you the same courtesy. Please know that I regret my actions more than words can express." When he finished the letter, Marcus folded it carefully and handed it to one of the officers, asking if there was any way it could reach the guard. The officer nodded silently, tucking the letter into a folder without comment. Whether it would ever make it to its intended recipient, Marcus didn't know, but writing it gave him a small sense of relief, as though he had taken the first step toward making things right. In the days that followed, Marcus found himself reflecting on his own behavior, not just during this trip, but throughout his life. He realized that his desire to stand out often came at the expense of others' feelings or boundaries. Back home, people laughed off his antics because they knew him, but here, in a foreign land, his actions carried a different kind of weight. He had crossed a line he hadn't fully understood until now. By the time Marcus was released from custody, he felt like a changed man. The bright-eyed tourist who had arrived in London eager to create unforgettable memories was gone, replaced by someone humbled and introspective. As he stepped out of the police station, blinking in the daylight, he knew he had a long road ahead of him. But for the first time, he also felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, he could turn this dark chapter into something meaningful. It wouldn't be easy, but Marcus was determined to try. The courtroom was packed on the day of Marcus's trial, with reporters scribbling notes and cameras flashing as he entered. The atmosphere was tense, a mix of curiosity and anger hanging heavy in the air. Tourists and locals alike had gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs that ranged from "Respect our heritage" to "Forgiveness over punishment." Inside, the judge sat sternly at the front, his expression unreadable as the prosecution laid out the charges against Marcus: criminal damage, public disorder, and endangerment. As the details of the incident were recounted, the flaming hat, the panicked crowd, the guard's composed reaction, Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He kept his head down, avoiding the stares of those in the room. Some looked at him with outright disdain, while others seemed conflicted, unsure whether to label him a villain or a misguided fool. His lawyer argued passionately on his behalf, emphasizing his remorse and lack of prior offenses. "He made a grave mistake," the lawyer said, "but he has taken full responsibility and is committed to making amends." When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he stood slowly, his hands trembling as he gripped the sides of the podium. For a moment, he hesitated, unsure where to begin. Then, taking a deep breath, he started. "I want to apologize to the guard, to the people of London, and to everyone who witnessed what happened that day. I came here to enjoy your beautiful city and culture, but instead I disrespected it. I didn't understand the significance of the guards or the traditions they represent, and for that, I am truly sorry." His voice cracked as he continued. "What I did was reckless and selfish. I thought I was being funny, but I see now that my actions caused harm and upset. I've spent every day since thinking about how I can make this right, not just for me, but for everyone involved." As he spoke, some in the audience softened slightly, exchanging glances as if reconsidering their initial judgments. Others remained unmoved, their arms crossed tightly over their chests. The judge listened carefully before delivering his verdict. Marcus was sentenced to community service, fined heavily, and ordered to attend cultural sensitivity classes. While the punishment wasn't as severe as it could have been, the weight of the consequences still hit Marcus hard. He knew the legal penalties were only part of the battle. He would carry the stigma of his actions for years to come. Outside the courthouse, the debate raged on. Social media buzzed with reactions, hashtags like #TouristResponsibility and #CulturalRespect trending worldwide. Opinion pieces flooded newspapers, some calling Marcus a cautionary tale, others urging compassion for someone trying to learn from their mistakes. Protesters held vigils near Buckingham Palace, lighting candles in support of the royal guards and demanding stricter rules for tourists behaving irresponsibly. Amid the chaos, Marcus returned to Australia, greeted not by cheers but by silence. Friends avoided mentioning the incident, and family members struggled to find the right words. Despite the awkwardness, Marcus decided to use his experience as an opportunity to educate others. He began speaking at local schools and community centers, sharing his story and warning against the dangers of cultural insensitivity. "You don't have to be perfect when you travel," he told audiences, "but you do have to be respectful. Learn about the places you visit, understand their customs, and think twice before doing something that might hurt someone else." Slowly, Marcus's efforts began to gain traction. The local news station featured his story, highlighting his journey from recklessness to redemption. Viewers were divided. Some praised him for owning up to his mistakes, while others dismissed his campaign as too little, too late. Still, Marcus pressed on, determined to turn his humiliation into something positive. He launched a social media page called Mindful Traveler, posting tips and reflections on responsible tourism. To his surprise, it gained followers quickly, with many travelers thanking him for sparking important conversations. Though the scars of the incident remained, both personally and publicly, Marcus found solace in knowing he was making progress. Every time someone reached out to say they'd learned something from his story, he felt a small measure of peace. The road to redemption was long and challenging, but Marcus knew he couldn't undo the past. He could only work to create a better future, one step at a time. And perhaps someday he might return to London, not as a troublemaker, but as someone eager to rebuild trust and show genuine respect. Years had passed since the infamous incident at Buckingham Palace, and Marcus had worked tirelessly to rebuild his life. The journey wasn't easy. There were moments when old news articles resurfaced online or snide comments from strangers reminded him of his past mistake. But Marcus refused to let those setbacks define him. Instead, he focused on turning his misstep into a meaningful mission, promoting responsible tourism and cultural sensitivity. Back in Australia, Marcus became a familiar face in schools, community centers, and travel expos. He spoke candidly about his experience, sharing the story of how a reckless decision nearly cost him everything. "I'd wanted to stand out," he often said during his talks, "but I ended up standing out for all the wrong reasons. I learned the hard way that making memories shouldn't come at the expense of someone else's dignity." His honesty resonated with audiences, especially young travelers eager to explore the world but unaware of the potential consequences of careless actions. His social media platform, Mindful Traveler, grew exponentially, becoming a hub for tips on respectful travel and reflections on cultural understanding. Marcus posted videos of himself visiting local landmarks, interacting with communities, and learning about traditions firsthand. In one particularly popular post, he shared footage of himself taking part in an Indigenous Australian ceremony, explaining how immersing himself in different cultures had deepened his appreciation for diversity. Followers flooded the comments section with gratitude, calling him an inspiration and pledging to be more mindful travelers themselves. Then came the invitation that changed everything. A letter from a London-based organization dedicated to fostering global tourism ethics. They asked Marcus to speak at their annual conference, held just blocks away from Buckingham Palace. At first, Marcus hesitated. Returning to the scene of his greatest failure felt daunting, even after all these years. But something inside him urged him to accept. It was time to face the place where it all began, not as the person he used to be, but as the person he had worked so hard to become. The day of the conference arrived, and Marcus stood nervously backstage, adjusting his tie and rehearsing his speech in his head. As he stepped onto the stage, the audience erupted into applause, not mocking or sarcastic, but genuine. Faces filled with curiosity and respect greeted him, and for the first time in years, Marcus felt truly seen, not as the man who burned a royal guard's hat, but as someone who had grown from his mistakes. In his speech, Marcus didn't shy away from recounting the details of that fateful day. "I was selfish and thoughtless," he admitted, his voice steady. "But I'm here today because I believe we can learn from our failures. Every culture deserves respect, not just as tourists, but as human beings sharing this planet." After the event, Marcus decided to visit Buckingham Palace one last time. Clutching a bouquet of flowers, he approached the gates quietly, his heart pounding. He laid the blooms gently at the foot of the entrance, bowing his head in silent apology. A guard stood nearby, tall and stoic as ever, his bearskin hat gleaming under the sunlight. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Marcus offered a small, sincere nod. The guard's expression remained neutral, but Marcus swore he saw the faintest flicker of acknowledgement, a sign that maybe, just maybe, forgiveness was possible. As Marcus walked away from the palace, he felt lighter than he had in years. The road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, but he knew he had taken the necessary steps to make amends. Though scars remained, they no longer weighed him down. Instead, they served as reminders of how far he'd come. Marcus smiled to himself, knowing that while he couldn't erase the past, he could continue building a future rooted in respect, humility, and growth. And that, he realized, was its own kind of redemption.